Welcome to this installment of Data Science Simplified. I am Dr. Mechi Kengla, and I am the founder and chief data strategist of Data Products. Today, we have the pleasure of talking to Katy Pusch about human data interaction. Katy Pusch is a data science product director at Lone Wolf Technologies. She has held dual data science and product management positions, harnessing research and data to deliver actionable insights that improve outcomes, and delivering customer grade dashboards for data legibility. Well, thank you for joining us today, Katy. We're very glad you're here.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a privilege.
So, yes, we're going to talk about human data interaction. Why don't I cue you in terms of explaining what that is?
Yes. So human data interaction is a burgeoning discipline. It has existed for many years now. And human data interaction is just all about how people interact with data in a variety of contexts. So, how individuals interact with data personally about them, raw data, right, and user control over my data. It's also about the way humans manipulate, analyze, and make sense of large unstructured data sets. It's about collaboration with data and how we develop communication tools that enable collaboration about that data. It's about delivering personalized and understandable data from big data sets. And it's also about providing access and understanding about data to the individuals that it affects, so that there's awareness of that interaction.
Very good. So, it sounds to me from what you're explaining like this is something that's very important. I would say quite critical, really, to any use of data in any regards at all.
Yes, I would say so. Yes. There's the Interaction Design Foundation is a group that, let's say, it's a group that, what's the word I'm looking for? Curates a lot of information about human data interaction on their website, and so that's a site that I've spent a fair amount of time on, and I would encourage anyone who's interested in data to potentially check them out as well, because it's a really deep topic that we can only really scratch the surface of today, and I'm excited to do that.
Right. So let's dive right into it, right? In
Yep.
terms of the actual actionable how this can be used. So when we talk about data scientists in regards to data, usually they're brought in at the stage where the data is already there, not in the collection phase, but more of this is the sort of data that we have, or this is the sort of problem that we're trying to solve, and this is the sort of data that we have at our arsenal. In
Yep.
your experience, what examples would you say of such where colleagues have been brought into new projects and asked to identify the relevant information to make decisions on how data will be stored, managed, and or utilized.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the context that I bring to this question is just that I oversee both product management and statistical data science at our company. And then I work with partners in engineering who manage data engineering and machine learning engineering. Um, so typically, my group is always responsible for that problem identification and for informing what types of information we're going to use to answer this question. And we'll collaborate with the data engineering group as well as the machine learning engineers about how to productionalize that information most effectively. So um, this is extremely collaborative for us, and um, I would say that if I were in a situation where I was asked to make decisions about, how the data needed to be stored and managed in the long term, while that's not something I'm responsible for today, the process would probably look very similar. Data science is ultimately research, and research is always better when you have diverse viewpoints at the table and when you're able to have the benefit of peer review, and different opinions, right? Making a stronger game plan. So it would look very similar. I would seek out the guidance and the feedback of peers and mentors, and then we would make a decision that we were comfortable with that process for us looks like problem identification, um, data identification, sort of matching up the data to the problem that we want to solve, understanding whether we need to generate new pieces of information or if we already have what we need in our data set. And then from there, working with the data engineering and machine learning engineering on how we need to maybe reformat or restructure that data for long term, right, production ready, scalable work.
Right. Oh, wow. So that sounds like there's a lot of involvement of more than one group in there with several people that basically would basically touch on this data.
Yep.
And taking it back to the original introduction, the way you cued it in, you mentioned sensitivity of the data as well, right? And
Yep.
privacy. So, are there any trainings that are provided to staff or guidelines or policies in place in general, whether it's in your particular organizations or organizations at large, with regards to handling data that could be sensitive, especially given that it has multiple touch points?
Absolutely. There's a number of different, I work in the United States. And so, in particular, in the United States, there's a number of sort of regulations that govern compliance and legality with regards to use of personally identifiable information, PII, and also, really specifically, what a breach definition is and what to do in the case of a breach. And these are very important, and sometimes they differ based on the type of PII that you're looking at. For instance, healthcare data and financial data are governed by slightly different laws, right, in some ways. But in all of these cases, I generally speaking, when you're working in an industry that has any of these very specific types of regulations, then that specific training would be provided by your company, your business, so that you're qualified to interact with the data and that you know what to do if something, if you do encounter a breach or anything that you need to handle with the data. Aside from that, though, I would encourage anyone not to just wait for the training that their company provides. Um, it's a really important um, responsibility to be a data steward. The way that we use data in data science impacts people's lives, and I think it's really important never to forget that. And so, when you're thinking about interacting with PII, um, a first rule of thumb is probably try not to interact with PII,
Right.
and B, to the extent that you need to, certainly educate yourself on the most appropriate ways to handle that data and destroy that data when you no longer need it.
Absolutely. That's critical. And you mentioned breaches, and I personally have been a victim of my data being breached within an organization, and this is sensitive data as well. And although there are guidelines, unfortunately, in the United States, because there are no hard, I should say, penalties for organizations that fail or encounter these breaches. Uh, they have had we've seen quite a few, and I used to have a data set that actually has a mapping of the breaches, and what you find is they are highly concentrated in North America, right?
Interesting.
Yeah, so it's
I
not
didn't know
just
that.
that there are PI data everywhere in Europe,
Yeah.
in Asia, in Africa, in South America. However, there are high concentration of breaches
Yeah.
resides in North America, and it's because it's more valuable and the for the data it's more valuable one, but also the organizations, in my opinion, get a slap on the hand, don't get punished enough when those breaches do occur.
That's really interesting, and I think that's really good to emphasize, right? Because companies do provide some kind of training, but it can sometimes be just sort of a check the box type of training to meet the minimum requirements. So I think your research is even more evidence that, right, take it upon yourself to educate yourself and be responsible if you want to be a good practitioner of data science.
So, is it fair to say that the goal is always to minimize that human interaction with the data as much as possible to avoid security breaches and errors? And if yes, if you think that's so, expand a little bit and tell us why and how is that fostered?
That is absolutely my rule of thumb is if you can avoid interacting with PII at all, then it's desirable to do so. Ideally, in some companies that I've worked at, this PII is stripped away before the data science team even gets it. You need special accesses to the databases that have PII in it. So ideally, you'll find that your company is doing something like that. If they are not, then again, I would encourage you to take it upon yourself to get rid of any PII that you don't need access to. Um, Another just good practice that I believe in is if you believe that you need to keep the PII in your data set, if it is truly necessary in order for you to build your model or conduct your analysis that you have this PII, then I would challenge you to document that rationale and also share that with peers to get a different perspective, to challenge any assumptions that you're making about why you feel like you need that data and the analysis, and to think about alternatives that you might be able to use instead. Because the more we can limit the use of PII, the less likely it breaches.
That's actually a fantastic suggestion. Basically, creating some sort of a framework where before you deal with any sort of a good rule of thumb, where before you handle or work with any data that's sensitive, you basically have a justification that meets some sort of a level of standards, guidance by that framework to share with peers or whether it's within the company outside and just get critique and feedback and
Yeah.
or workarounds. That's a fantastic. Maybe we should all put our minds together and work in such of a and creating such a guideline or framework.
Yeah, that would be helpful.
All right. So we're talking a bit more about the interaction. And when we're talking about the interaction, let's take a little bit of a step back and talk about the actual collection. So, what about the tools that are used for the data collections in different circumstances? In your view, what's advisable to use in terms of the tools, and when should new tools be created as opposed to leveraging the ones that already exist?
For data collection tools in particular, with my role in product management, I have a little bit of a business-minded answer to this. So my business answer is it's appropriate to build a new data collection tool or methodology when it delivers a competitive advantage to how you're going to solve the problem that you set out to solve. So if this gives you proprietary data that helps you answer a question that nobody else can answer by collecting data in this new way or this new type of data that other people aren't collecting, then it's appropriate to build a new tool rather than leverage one that already exists. Um, in particular, what you'll see at software companies, because that's where about half of my data science focus has been, is at software companies. The data collection tool that we're leveraging for our analyses and our models is actually the data that's being collected in our software. So that's one example, maybe not the one that you particularly were calling out, but that's one example of building your own data collection tool. Effectively, any piece of software is a data collection tool. So,
Right.
um,
Yeah. Um, and any discussion of human data interaction should probably include the pitfalls of the human element, right? Um, we always, and, and I'm going to play a bit of a devil's advocate. So let me start with this. So the
okay.
pitfalls of the human element. Where do data scientists often go wrong in this regard?
Um, I think where I'll focus my thoughts on this topic are in the communication of the data outputs. So, a common frustration that I'll hear from data scientists and data analysts is when they're communicating their findings, either people don't understand or people don't seem to care. And this really is just a communication barrier. And it's one that I faced earlier in my career as well. I was quite frustrated early on by feedback that I needed to add more words to some of my presentations because I would show a visualization to the audience, and the feedback would be like, "Please write what we're supposed to take away from this visualization." And as someone early in my career, I thought, "But that's redundant. The chart says that. Why would I why would I type another sentence? It's just saying the same thing." And so that's the general anecdote that I would share about the opportunity that data scientists have, because I've seen it in others as well. Is that to you, the visualization or the equation that came from your model, right? These statistical measures, they mean something to you. They often don't mean something to large portions of your audience who otherwise might be very interested in your findings. And so say it twice. I know that you feel like you're saying it with the data, but say it in plain language as well. Your audience will thank you.
Absolutely, yes, that's key. I myself, when I started out, I had to learn or relearn how to call out the conclusion I was trying to point out in the very executive speak, so
Yeah.
that executives can actually understand the point I was driving at. And it is a critical skill. It is really. It's one that should be learned.
Yep.
So you use examples in terms of, and this is a nice part in terms of the human interaction part of the data.
Yeah.
Now let's delve a little bit deeper and talk more about the human interaction in terms of the crafting of the algorithms that leverage the data. What responsibilities we're talking now here? We're
Yeah.
basically hinting at biases, right?
Yep.
Inherent biases in the software and in the heuristics, if you will.
Yep.
How should we, or what sort of considerations should an analyst, a data scientist have, or their rules of thumb that they should keep in mind when they're actually building out a heuristic or an algorithm to ensure that bias doesn't play a huge role?
I'm certainly not the person who invented this, but I hold it dear to my heart and think about it often. The absence of like specific data points that are biased that you think about as fueling bias. So, for instance, just because your data set excludes information about age or race or gender or ethnicity doesn't mean that your algorithm won't still produce biased results.
Right.
Um, and this is something that I rely pretty heavily with my peers and peer review in the statistics field on is framing and thinking through research to ensure that if we're building an algorithm, we also have companion research to investigate whether there's unintended bias or factors that were not accounted for before we release it to the wild. So that's how I've approached it. I'm interested in your feedback as well because sometimes the feedback that I've received from the business side is that that's not a very efficient way to do things. Sometimes the business doesn't like that we need these companion projects. So I don't know if you have a more efficient way to accomplish that.
Well, I it's more just being mindful until something much more standard comes along, or some great research comes along. Just being mindful about the sort of algorithm you're creating,
Yeah,
and more critically, who is going to be the end user in terms of who's the data is going to apply to, the insights that you get from the algorithm.
yeah,
Who's that going to apply to? That's heavily critical. You
absolutely.
need to have that sort of connection. And yes, you should be mindful in companion projects so that you're sort of mitigating that risk is a great way. And you've heard probably in news, there's a whole lot of hoorah about um, the craziness, I use craziness in quotes here, around um, bias in data and the dangers of that.
Yeah,
And as a woman of color myself, that's something that's very critical to me in terms of you find that the biases are usually with populations that are disproportionately the minority.
yes,
On the other hand, I should say this, the algorithms themselves, right? So there is a sort of a talk war going on between, you have the human that's basically managing the data. You should watch out for the algorithm, ensure that the algorithm is mindful. But the bias is transferred, right?
right, right.
It's not from nowhere, it comes from you. So
Yep,
even if you have a a gatekeeper,
yep,
right? There's still that possibility that the bias is going to come through. So,
yes,
which was better? You're telling me that humans are more biased or algorithms are more biased?
yep,
So, it's a philosophical question and argument that can go both ways. I feel, though, until the way we interpret and deal with machine learning in terms of applying it to our current lifestyle improves in a more highly efficient manner, humans is all we got. I would trust a human much more than I would trust a machine as
yeah.
being the decipherer of what is biased and what is not.
My favorite example of that is you may have seen this because it's everywhere. There's lots of different examples of the linguistic machine learning where the words that a machine learned algorithm will choose for a woman versus a man in the same context are very different. um,
Yes.
so,
And there are even much more crazy examples. Like, and these were big companies, big research companies that are well esteemed in research and AI
yeah,
and machine learning, like Microsoft or Google
yeah.
and Facebook. They've all had their own issues with implicit bias being baked into the algorithm.
I am, and this is one area where I don't have the perfect answer to this, but I do feel strongly that we are responsible for the algorithms that we put out in the world, and we are responsible for for the results of that algorithm, right? If our algorithm results in bias, then the person who wrote that algorithm is indeed responsible for that. Not necessarily legally in our case, but morally, certainly, ethically. And so I think that's one reason that I'm particularly cautious and conservative about the work that I do because some of the products that I work on inform hiring decisions, for instance, right? Who's going to get the call? It shouldn't be the only input to a hiring decision. I'll say that as well. We're very intentional to have disclaimers and claim this does not, right? This is not the hiring decision, but it's still intended to help sort of prioritize your recruiting efforts, right? And so who's going
Right.
to get that call to be invited in for an interview first, right? As you're working your way down the list. And it's extremely important when you're dealing with someone's livelihood. In this case, there's many other examples of how it impacts people's lives. Whether you're in the healthcare field or the financial field or anything else, but I just think it's really important to tell yourself that every day and to understand and know it that the work that you do impacts someone else's life and that you are responsible for that. And the least that we can do is be really intentional about how we approach checking ourselves through peer review, through, right, like question yourself every step of the way, and try to get other opinions and put in your best due diligence to ensure that you're protecting against this.
Right. So, ladies and gentlemen, I could not have said it any better. You are responsible, really, for the work you put out there because it does affect others' life. So, there you have it. That's a little bit about human data interaction. Thank you again, Katie. We really, really love having
Thank you.
you. And we would love to have you in the future in another segment if you're all right with that.
I would love to come back.
All right. For more data science insights and future installments of Data Science Simplified, just subscribe to our YouTube channel at Data Products. You can also follow us on Facebook as Data Products LLC or on Twitter at Data Products. Well, keep safe and see you next time. Bye.